Did you ever wonder why words like communism and socialism are dirty words in America? Well, there's a long history behind it. So let's start at a reasonable point with World War II. In World War II, Russia initially had a neutrality pact, or a non-aggression pact, with Germany. So it wasn't being attacked by Japan, it wasn't being attacked by Germany, it wasn't being attacked by Italy. But then Hitler, realizing he was running out of space in Europe, and saw with big, big, greedy eyes that Russia had tons of space, he turned on them and broke the pact and attacked him, which was the biggest mistake, most likely, of his career. That was probably the turning point in World War II that was spelled doom for Nazi Germany. During the war, Russians at some point had been treated very poorly by Germans. So when America and the Russians started gaining the upper hand, some bad things happened. Now, I'm not talking about the bad things that America did, like carpet bombing entire German cities, killing huge numbers of civilians it was unnecessary, or dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which caused huge numbers of civilian losses to force the emperor to give up. I'm talking about after D-Day, the Allies got in contact with the Polish resistance, and they said to them, the Russians and you are jointly going to attack and push the Germans out of Poland. And so the Polish resistance got ready, and at the appointed time, they started to attack. But the Russians did not. They held back. The Polish fought as hard as they possibly could, waiting and waiting for the Russians to aid them. But the problem was there was some bad blood between the Russians and the Polish. And the Polish were on their own. In fact, the Russians waited until both sides were so weak that they could sweep in and destroy both of them. Yes, the Russian army not only destroyed the Germans, but also the Polish resistance. As the war wound down, Germans, when they were caught by Americans, were happy. In fact, civilians would give them gifts and cheer and stuff. And the Americans thought, well, that's strange. And then they thought, well, I guess they didn't really want to be under Hitler. But eventually what they discovered was that the Germans were happy to have been overrun by the Americans, because when the Russians would come into these villages, they would treat the Germans horribly, just like previously the Germans had treated the Russians poorly. So they were getting revenge. And the Germans were happy to escape that revenge. I guess that's understandable. Unfortunately, as you probably know, after the war, the USSR under Stalin continued their policy of abusing citizens. But remember, Eastern Europe had been given to Russia, or the USSR as it was called eventually, the United Soviet Socialist Republic. So the Russians treated the Eastern Bloc countries poorly, but they also treated their own people poorly. from east to west, north to south. There were pogroms in which many, many millions of Russians and other ethnic groups died. Many more than Hitler and his Nazis had killed in Germany and the rest of Europe. It was genocidal. It was widespread, and it was merciless. This behavior continues to this day, although you won't hear about it necessarily, under the guise of religion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. During that period, there was the Cold War with the USSR, in which there was a race between the USSR and the United States of America to be the top power. Now, don't get me wrong, both countries were very busy destabilizing any country they thought would be a benefit to them through invasions, through coups, through assassinations, and propping up dictators and helping allies and spying on each other, stealing technology from each other. The Cold War went on and on. During the 50s, the Cold War was so intense that we had the McCarthy era, in which Senator McCarthy whipped everybody up into a frenzy of fear and convinced them to turn anybody who was behaving like a communist, because the USSR was communist. And people, just like the witch hunts of the days of yore, were falsely accused, and sometimes they were imprisoned, sometimes they were blacklisted from their industry. Hollywood was hit very hard, and it became very uncomfortable for anybody who did not stand up and say, I'm with McCarthy, kind of a deal, just like had happened in Germany. Fortunately, that changed. McCarthy, who was really a criminal, I mean literally, lost power, and America started to return to some sense of pseudo-normalcy for the whites, at least. The male whites. Women were still chattel or property. The blacks, the Hispanics, the Asians, and so on were all still oppressed minorities, not to mention the Native Americans, who had been pooped on by the American government since before there was an American government. So the Cold War turned into a nuclear Cold War. And it's called a Cold War because there wasn't a lot of fighting directly between the USSR and America. Just like right now, the Ukraine is a proxy for a whole bunch of nations that are funneling money and resources to it to fight Russia. Because if they get directly involved, Putin swears he will use nuclear weapons. So all they can do is send equipment, training, money, food, medical stuff. So at some point, I think it was in the 50s, Oppenheimer's team must have taken the atomic bomb to new levels. Now, poor Oppenheimer, he was vilified, and things went very badly for him for decades. But that's another story, and you can watch the Oppenheimer film to learn about that. It got so bad that people were building fallout shelters in their backyards. And there was a lot of fear. And I remember when in the 80s, when I was in high school, there was a lot of fear amongst us young people that there was going to be a nuclear war. And we knew what that meant. We knew that horrible, horrible things would happen to all of us because of radiation. I even wrote a poem called Boom Goes the World and presented it at some forensics competitions. But that's beside the point. Ultimately, as I predicted to a friend in the mid-'80s, the USSR collapsed because it could no longer compete with capitalism and espionage. And so the Berlin Wall was destroyed. East and Western Europe were reunited to great cheers from both sides as they worked together to tear down the walls. And a new era erupted for that part of the world. So, historically, we have those things, but there's more than just that. The other part of the story involves the very rich. You see, they have become very comfortable accruing massive amounts of wealth and land and power and such here in the U.S. under the capitalistic system of economy and business. And they want the free market system to become real because that means they can do anything in the market that they want to. And anything can be offered. Any drugs, pornography, slaves, child sex slaves, anything at all. It would be like going to a country of pirates where there are no rules except for the rule of strength and power and wealth. And they fear true communism and true socialism because neither of them have any space in them for the greedy super rich, those mentally ill people. They fear that they will lose everything they've got to communism or to socialism. So they tell half-truths, they lie. Now, I'm not promoting communism and socialism, don't get me wrong. But we have to remember that ancient societies were based at some point or other in their existence on a form of community life, of shared resources. And there are some communities that still do that, although they are disappearing because of the influence of capitalism and other things. So nowadays, the super rich don't want you to believe there's anything good about socialism or capitalism, and it doesn't really matter which ism we're talking about, because as long as people are in control of an ism will always be corrupted by those who have the mental illnesses to want to collect more wealth and power and more and more and more. Every system will fail because no system can contain such people easily. So they throw out the words, he's a communist, she's a socialist, as if that means a bad thing. But it doesn't necessarily. It really depends on the individual. And the people that are often pointing their fingers are the ones who are bad. Now, when I say the people who are pointing their fingers, I don't mean everybody who's doing that. I'm talking about the people who actually start that trend. The other people who don't really understand why, they don't understand what's going on and how they're being gaslit, how they're being manipulated. They're not necessarily bad people unless they're doing it because they know they're going to get power and money. And some of them are doing that. So now you understand why in the United States of America, communism and socialism are dirty words. And I want you to remember, words are not dirty. People are. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.